It's definitely a pleasure to speak at the conference of one of the key organisations promoting the green industries. I was a special advisor at DEC for 2 years, and we always felt, particularly when we were having discussions with BIS, that the green sector or the green sectors lacked the kind of major voices that you saw in some other areas of industry. So the more that can develop, the better. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about what we plan to put in our next manifesto, but I was also asked to talk about what we saw as important about the coalition record. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on that. What I did was go back at look at the coalition programme that was negotiated in those 5 fairly hectic days following the election in May 2010, which you might remember. And look at particularly the DEC and BIS and Treasury sections and pick out what the green commitments were. And actually, there were 25 commitments on energy and climate change and green industry related issues. And I think it's a reasonable argument to say we've at least started and made reasonable progress on 16 of those. And I've just listed all of them. I'm not going to read them all out. You can see the presentation afterwards. Clearly, not all of these have been successful yet. The Green Deal obviously lacks a lot of the kind of impetus we wanted to see. But I think there's some really important ones in there, including establishing the Green Investment Bank, creating a community renewable strategy, electricity market reform, and all the others there. Of the remaining 9, I think it's probably fair to say the commitment remains, but we've made pretty slow progress on 4 of them, though we are making some progress, and abandoned or no progress on 5. And you will note that the last 3 of those 5 are all tax issues or Treasury issues, where it was the Treasury's fault that we didn't make any progress. And one criticism I think you can quite fairly level at this government is that the green commitment, which was there quite genuinely, I think, to begin with, has not been translated equally through all departments. And DEC and DEFRA have had a running battle against departments like Treasury and, in some cases, BIS to try and achieve things. I also think that there are obviously things that the government has done which were not in the coalition programme, which are of significant importance, including, I think, sustaining funding for renewable energy and through the levy control framework into the future, and the 4th carbon budget, which I actually agreed with a lot of the criticisms that Barry levied at us at the coalition. I don't speak on behalf of the government, but the 4th carbon budget has been set, and although Osborne was talking about reviewing it, it is not going to be reviewed. The government has decided there will be no review of it, so that was one thing he got wrong. Also, it's probably fair to say that if you look at the natural environment sector, or the DEFRA sections of the coalition programme, they're mostly dealing with more traditional natural environment issues, biodiversity, habitats, countryside and farming. And the programme for sort of green industry in the DEFRA section was distinctly less ambitious and has been less successful. So a kind of pretty mixed picture, I think. It's not entirely fair to say, as Barry was trying to point out, that we've been a failure on everything. But true to say, we haven't been or the coalition government hasn't been as effective as one would have liked us to have been. However, I think it's a reasonable argument to say it would have been a lot worse without the Liberal Democrats in government. And you don't have to take my word for it. I've quoted 2 quotes from our chair, James. One thing he said in October 2013, Lib Dems' commitment to the green economy is heartfelt and deep-rooted. Nick Clegg is to be believed when he says any government that contains the Lib Dems will push for ambitious green policies, not least because his party will always demand it. Now, that's slightly selective quoting, and it should be fair to say he then went on in the next sentence to say Nick Clegg needs to be a lot better at pushing it. But nevertheless, that's what he said. And in the run-up to the Euro elections, he said, as with next year's election, Lib Dem leadership will argue with some justification, it has been a driving force behind the successful green policies the coalition has introduced. And I think, going back to 2010 again, when we negotiated the coalition programme, actually it was one of the less difficult bits of the programme to negotiate, because the commitments in the Conservative manifesto on green issues were actually not very different from the commitments in our manifesto or in the Labour manifesto. And it looked like all 3 parties were converging. But we thought that the Conservatives actually believed in what they put in their manifesto. And I think it's become steadily clearer during the last 4 years that they don't. And I think when I was a special advisor in DEC, it was probably fair to say there were a small number of Tory ministers and MPs who really understood the argument and campaigned for it. And I would include people like Oliver Letwin, Caroline Spellman, William Hague, slightly surprisingly, and a bunch of junior ministers, including Greg Barker at DEC. And it's very sad to see most of them have now gone or on the way out. People like Laura Sands and Greg Barker are not standing at the next election, and William Hague not standing at the next election. And the number of Tory MPs and ministers who really support the Green agenda is dwindling. Most of the Conservative Party, I think 4 years ago, thought that there was something in this Green agenda, but we had to get the economy right before we got around to doing it, and didn't understand the interlinkages of environment and the economy. But there was a small, a sizable group, though it was a minority then, that were opposed to anything to do with the climate change agenda, anything to do with renewables, and particularly anything to do with onshore wind. And I think I'd agree with Barry, and I see the importance of that group, pushed by the losses to UKIP, and the UKIP agenda has grown in importance, and the Conservative Party was in a much worse position it was when we negotiated the coalition programme with them. However, that's the past. Now I'm looking to the future. Now, we are a democratic party, and we derive our manifesto from the policies that are agreed by our party conference and by our policy committee, which I've just been re-elected to. And in September, so you don't need to take my word for what we're going to do, in September we published this document, the pre-manifesto, Stronger Economy and a Fairer Society, enabling every person to get on in life. And it was debated and agreed by our conference in October. And you can see a copy of it on the party website. And what I'm just going to do is take you quickly through the green industry and energy sections. And what we're doing now on the manifesto group is developing the pre-manifesto, adding more detail to it, adding bits that are missing, and we have 3 months to do that, basically, and we'll be finishing by about the beginning of March. But you will have a very good idea, a very clear idea of what the manifesto will say from what's in this pre-manifesto document that I will take you through fairly quickly. So on the green industry, we have a commitment to establish a long-term framework for energy and green policy, particularly aiming at a zero-carbon Britain by 2050, so going beyond the Climate Change Act target of 80% reduction to 100% reduction. We want to see the current Natural Capital Committee, temporary Natural Capital Committee, given the statutory backing and tasked with recommending legally binding natural resource targets, so trying to mirror the framework that the Climate Change Committee is imposing on government, the long-term framework imposing on government for decisions on natural capital. Green Investment Bank, we would aim to increase its capitalisation, expand its remit, give it borrowing powers, which I agree with Barry, it would have been better if it had it already, and enable it to issue green bonds. So setting the framework for investment support. More innovation funding, obviously this is all subject to the extent to which government can spend, which is obviously still constrained, and we will publish a separate costings programme alongside the manifesto in April, at the beginning of the campaign, the election campaign. But we want to see more innovation funding, a ring-fenced science budget, more catapult centres, and a green innovation arm and a new business bank. Public procurement policy should be used to drive the adoption of green services and green technologies through higher green criteria. And we wanted to focus R&D and innovation and development funding from government on a number of technologies where we believe Britain has a genuine lead and can help to provide the basis for future prosperity and jobs. Tidal power, CCS, energy storage, ultra-low emission vehicles, the leading ones, others as well. And just touching on transport briefly, ambitious EU vehicle emission standards and the target for the UK of having only ultra-low carbon non-freight vehicles on the roads by 2040. Just going at energy, looking at energy, particularly a legally binding decarbonisation target by 2030, as the CCC recommended, an indicative target of 60% of electricity from renewables by 2030, which is at the kind of top of the current estimates. Energy saving as a key infrastructure priority with new energy efficiency standards, and building on the Green Deal, which has, as I said, been disappointing so far, establishing a council tax discount for people who take up Green Deal improvements and improve their homes, and new energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector. We'd aim to end use of unabated coal in electricity by 2025, and any new gas stations after 2030 fitted with CCS. Boost UK-wide community energy investment, building on the community renewable strategy set out by DEC quite recently. And new nuclear power stations are okay, we'd be happy with them, provided those concerns can be addressed and without any public subsidy for new build. And then continue to back new entrants to the energy market to improve competition and promote proper competition against the big six. briefly touching on international issues, argue for a 50% reduction in EU GHG emissions by 2030, more ambitious than they're going for. Obviously work to secure agreement on the Global Climate Treaty at Paris next year. Argue for EU and global commitments to zero net deforestation, 2020, greater resources for international environmental cooperation, and other arms of government, development aid, trade and investment agreements to support environmentally sustainable investment, not undermine them as some of them do at the moment. So that's briefly the main issues. I haven't looked at the natural environment section just because I was aware I had limited time here, but obviously there are other commitments on biodiversity, habitats, landscape and countryside protection as well. But you will see them in the document, which I said is available on the party website. And what we've tried to do is to really try quite hard to mainstream green thinking throughout the pre-manifesto. What I've put up there is actually in several different sections in the pre-manifesto. We haven't just got one section on the environment, which is separate from a section on the economy. We've tried to build it into our key economic and international and social policies, understanding that successful economies and successful societies are green. It's not something you just add in at the end. It is a fundamental belief, a fundamental part of our thinking. And I hope we are being somewhat successful in doing that. Of course, the slight danger in that, actually, in giving talks like this or talking to green NGOs, is that actually the environmental stream gets a bit buried in the text of the manifesto. So we're trying to have it both ways. And the pre-manifesto also contains those commitments wrapped up in a kind of presentational means, which we call 5 green laws, which a Liberal Democrat government would introduce. And you can see them here. A Nature Act on legal targets for biodiversity, clean air, clean water, established the Natural Capital Committee in law, as I mentioned, Heating and Energy Efficiency Act on renewable and district heating programs, energy efficiency standards for homes, and step-up action on fuel poverty, a Zero Waste Britain Act to set Britain on the path to a circular economy, establishing a Stern report on resource use and waste and landfill. Zero Carbon Britain Act, picking up on what I said, strengthen the Climate Change Act targets, aiming for 100% reduction by 2050, decarb target for the electricity sector, and end the use of coal. And Green Transport Act on charging points for electric cars, incentivise greener travel choices, and update planning law. So historically, the Lib Dems have had, by all the various assessments that NGOs have come up with, we have tended to have the greenest of the 3 main parties' manifestos, and a bunch of us in the party have tried quite hard to make sure that the 2015 manifesto will again be the greenest of the 3 parties' manifestos. We faced an uphill struggle as the junior coalition partner in pushing this agenda in government, but I think we've done our best. We've had some successes, we've had some failures, but we have at least tried, and I want to see it, and I believe this will be a major part of our election campaign next year. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, Robert Spencer at URS. A couple of times the topic of the carbon price has come up as something that industry leaders would like to see to give surety and understanding about the way to go in corporate strategies. Is that something that you touched on in your pre-manifesto planning? I couldn't see it specifically in there, but maybe it's part of something that's already highlighted.
Yeah, actually, I should have mentioned, thanks for reminding me, that there's a lot more detail available in, we published a separate policy paper on climate policy, particularly on energy in 2013, and that was approved by conference in September 2013, and we do go into some detail about that. We think the right way to do it is to use the emissions trading scheme. Clearly that needs to be tighter than it is at the moment, in line with increasing EU targets. But if you've got an ETS scheme, the best thing to do is to make it work rather than try and supplement it with separate carbon price floors. But as I say, you will see more detail about that in that paper, which is also on the party website.
Martin Gibson from Temple Group. With the outlook likely to be another coalition, if you believe the newspapers, what would be your top 3 sort of red line issues if you were to go into red line issues on environmental if you were to go into coalition again?
It's a question we always get asked, and the answer is always the same. No one gives away their negotiating position before the negotiations start. So you can ask any Lib Dem politician, I mean, real politicians, not just backroom people like me, the question, and they will give you the same answer. You don't give away your red lines. What we will do, the same as we did in 2010, is publish our top priorities on the front page of, well, I don't know if it'll be on the front page of the manifesto, it'll be somewhere prominent. It was on the front page of the manifesto last time. And last time there were things like increase the income tax threshold, start bringing a pupil premium, parliamentary reform, which obviously we didn't manage to do, and a slightly looser one around building a green investment in the economy. We are still discussing those. There is absolutely no question that one of them, or possibly more than one of them, will be built around the green agenda. I think in terms of priorities, they have to play the role of highlighting what you stand for and helping us get our message across, always something we struggle with in the election. So it'll be something, I think there'll be something around energy efficiency, home energy improvements, but linked to the growth in that industry, the creation of jobs, as well as cutting people's energy bills and business energy bills and fuel poverty, because it ties into what most voters care about. But I think we would also like to see a stress on developing green industries, particularly the renewable industry, or areas where, other areas like green finance, where Britain has real strengths, as trying to show how we understand, or we believe that green industry is an essential part of recovery from recession and laying the foundations for future prosperity. But I said, how exactly those priorities are phrased is really difficult, and it's one of the things we'll be arguing about for the next 3 months.
Does the party leadership see this agenda as a potential vote winner? UKIP has grabbed all the headlines, but one of the other big political stories of the autumn has been the resurgence of the Greens and the fact that they're taking potentially 5, 6, 7% of the vote. And does your polling show that the kind of policies you've sketched out can work on the doorstep and can actually win you votes?
Yes, it does, and I think the leadership does understand it. The two things to note. One is that half of the current Greens vote are people who used to vote Liberal Democrats. So clearly they're people that we are upset about losing and would like to get back. The second thing is we've done quite a lot of detailed polling, asking people quite detailed policy questions around people who are currently saying they're voting for us and people who are currently saying they're voting for one of the other parties but would seriously consider voting for us. And within that group, which is obviously not the whole electorate, probably more like a quarter of the electorate, green issues score higher than the average, particularly almost anything to do with renewables and wind power in particular scores really well. So it's a kind of signal to our guys not to be worried about the anti-wind power campaigns. And also, green issues are particularly important and more than the average to people who are currently saying they're voting Conservative but would seriously consider voting Lib Dem. And one of the things they really don't like about the party they're currently supporting is their growing hostility to green issues. So yes, both from a kind of, we draw up a manifesto mostly based on what we believe is right, but also based on how we think we can build votes and win MPs. And happily, in this case, the issue plays into both areas.
Roger Venables, Chief Executive of SQL, the Sustainability Rating System for Infrastructure. I'm interested in your 5 acts of areas where you think legislation is necessary. One of the things that people regularly ask us about SQL, which is currently voluntary, is why don't you campaign for it to be made mandatory? Because one of the claims that our assessors make is that it improves projects by the project team using the question set as a driver for improvement. So out of that, I'm just wondering where are you in the balance between making something mandatory and by so doing turning it into a chore? Oh God, got to do another SQL assessment is not something we want to do. But at the same time, if it really does improve projects as our assessors tell us, then maybe making it mandatory would be a good thing. Where are you in this difficult decision making?
It's a bit difficult to give a general answer to that because it'll depend on the circumstances. In general, we are not a deregulatory party. We understand the value of regulation, particularly in building markets for green products and green services and green technologies, where the market by itself will not come up with it. So we have no problem about regulating where it's sensible, where it improves the likelihood of the outcome. Clearly, if you have a voluntary system that's working okay, then you possibly don't need to do that. There are other things, of course, the government can do to encourage take-up of systems like this through using public procurement policy, for example. Government is a big purchaser of products and services in all sectors of the economy. So you can try and encourage uptake there. In fact, actually, one thing, in real life, I'm a researcher. I work on a variety of international environmental issues, particularly on forests and the timber industry. And you can see there, actually, how British government procurement policy for legal and sustainable timber has turned something like 80% of the UK market into sustainably certified timber without using legislation. So there might be a case for legislation to kind of knock out the remaining 20%, but actually you can do a lot with voluntary measures and procurement policy, I think. But in some cases, clearly you need regulation, and we're not worried about it.
I made an observation which probably ties in with what Lynn was saying earlier, which is I liked your sort of summary act. So this is as much as an observation as a statement. I wonder if we need a culture change act as one of we have 5 measures, but we actually need a 6th one, Culture Change Act, because if we look at the kind of barriers that Lynn was bringing up earlier between the political parties, so actually that money got set aside as well to dissolve these barriers, both within government, within our industry, through the core sectors. I was giving guidance on the flooding recently, and what we found out is that the people who are sitting in the guidance along the table from one industry to another one, that if we started working more together as well, we would actually start solving many more problems. So this is actually a suggestion to the political parties of considering a culture change act to deal with the people issue. In the same way as you have actually educated us to stop smoking, how can we actually do the same thing in our sectors to reduce carbon?
Is there a case, because one of the criticisms that has been levelled at Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems, and they've achieved, and I agree with you entirely, quite a lot within the coalition on green agenda, but then maybe haven't spoken about it enough and haven't attempted to try and move the needle on public perception, behaviour change on these issues as much as they maybe did previously.
Yes, I think that's a fair point. There is a problem now, of course, with Nick Clegg, that actually, by and large, most people don't believe anything he says, sadly. And I wish it wasn't so, and I think it's really unfair because, I know him reasonably well. He's not the kind of caricature. But because of the whole history, and because people in this country aren't used to coalitions, and because of the awful mistakes we made over tuition fees, he is generally not believed. So he possibly isn't the right person to promote that kind of culture change. I would say just one thing, more broadly, one real problem with this country is our electoral system, which is not, and you would expect me to say that, countries with proportional electoral systems tend not to have such vicious disagreements between parties. And actually you can see that happening in Scotland even, since they had an elected parliament by proportional representation, where coalition government is the norm. Parties tend not to disagree automatically with everything the other parties do, partly because they may find themselves in coalition with them after the next election. And there's much more a culture of at least listening to what other parties say rather than automatically dissing them. I think one really depressing thing about this coalition government is that it's just been exactly the same as its predecessors. Everything the Labour Party says is bad. And as you got the impression from Barry this morning, everything we say from his point of view is bad. It isn't the case, I agree with a lot of what he says. He probably agrees with a lot of what the coalition's done. But the electoral system forces in, which is a winner-takes-all system, usually, first of us, it forces us into that kind of behaviour, and it is particularly poisonous to long-term agendas like the one we're addressing today.